You're watching Talking Point on Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Joining us from Oslo is Erik Solheim. He's been an ex-Undersecretary General at the United Nations, as well as the ex-Executive Director with the United Nations Environmental Programme. Mr. Solheim, welcome to Strat News again, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for your interest. It's so good to be with an important Indian channel like this.
And also from the Indian capital, New Delhi, Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee. He was India's permanent representative and ambassador at the United Nations and has a book on the United Nations, which is already out, a photo book, and I do believe another one that will be coming soon. Ambassador Mukherjee, again, thank you for giving us time.
Thank you, Amitabh, and it's a great pleasure to be on the panel with Mr. Erik Solheim, who we all know very well in the multilateral world for all his achievements. So I'm glad that you have us.
Mr. Solheim, the United Nations 75th anniversary, and it certainly, whatever view you are of, needs a new life that the United Nations General Assembly has also committed itself to on especially stalled Security Council reform.
Yes, this is, I mean, obviously the United Nations is the one global institution which is irreplaceable. We need a forum where all the powers, India, China, Europe, America, all can come together. So we for sure there is a huge need for the UN. But the COVID-19 has exposed what many people were pointing to before. I mean, during COVID-19, the UN has been largely irrelevant. The World Health Organization has played some role, except for that no one has seen the UN. No one even know the names of the top leaders of the UN. So it's largely irrelevant. And the states have come to the forefront. Have a need to discuss what are the deep reforms the UN needs to be able to live up to the promise.
Ambassador Mukherjee, you would also probably agree that the United Nations is not irrelevant. Would you think it's also irreplaceable in the current system, though in need for deep reform, as Mr. Solheim is pointing out?
Well, I agree with the point that the United Nations is not irrelevant, and that's because it is based on one founding principle, and that is the principle of international cooperation. That is what brought the multilateral system together from the League of Nations onwards 100 years ago. And since India has been a part of this multilateral system from 1919, I think we have a very strong sense of the fact that international cooperation is essential for making this multilateral system work. And as far as the United Nations currently is concerned, apart from what Mr. Solheim mentioned about its lack of coherence in responding to the pandemic, I think there's also a very, very visible, and you can see it these days in the General Assembly speeches by the world leaders, there is a complete fragmentation of a worldview which is going on, and that threatens the principle of international cooperation directly. So faced with this challenge, I think that the need for reforming the United Nations to make it more effective, to make it more transparent, and to make it much more visible, I think that is what is the need of the hour.
Mr. Solheim, there is a crisis of confidence in the United Nations, despite the surveys that have been put out, which do reflect various opinions across the globe. Reform that Ambassador Mukherjee is talking about, we've been hearing about it since 2005. There was incremental progress, many would say, till about 2015. But do you also subscribe to the view that it's the P5, the permanent 5 members, the veto-wielding members in the Security Council, that are in effect stymieing any deep reform?
I think that's part of the problem, but I don't think it's the whole problem. Obviously, there are vested interests here. I mean, look to the obvious. France and the United Kingdom, of course, were major powers before the Second World War. So you can understand why they get their veto power from that position. Today, India has a population of 1.3 billion people. is a very rapidly rising power, economic progress, and a lot of positive achievements. And the combined population of France and the UK is 1/10 of the Indian population. So obviously the permanent five is not mirroring the today's world, and it's much wider than that. When I came into UN Environment, I took a look at our staff, and I realized that we had many more employees from Finland than from India. Nothing wrong with Finland. It's a nice European nation, but it's 5 million people. How can that reflect the world? I realized we had one employee in the entire UN Environment from Indonesia. That's 250 million people. I mean, basically any European nation had many more employees than Indonesia. So you need a reform of the entire system of the UN, as well as a reform of the Security Council, and it simply must reflect the new world. By the way, we had also very few employees from China compared to what we had from Europe or United States.
Ambassador Mukherjee, I'm just going to take a comment while you also take up the issue of deep reform and the Security Council. It's from Tanuj Abhay Khanna, who says it's not the entire Security Council, but one member that is stymieing the reforms. Tell us a little bit more about, in your view, why reforms are not progressing, and we'll go on further then probably to talk about how it should be done.
Well, yes, and I will take the cue from what you said and focus on the Security Council. But I agree with Mr. Solheim that the reforms need to be comprehensive. It's not just only the Security Council. But when we look at the engine that drives the political agenda of the United Nations, it is definitely the Security Council, because it has a mandate given to it by the treaty, by the UN Charter. And here I think the point is that in 2005, as you said, all the 5 permanent members agreed. They didn't put any caveat to having early reforms of the Security Council. So the question that is asked is that 15 years later, in the year 2020, why has this not taken place? And when you look at what has happened on the ground, and people like us who have been involved in negotiating this mandate to implement it, we can tell you that this is basically because of the blocking tactics of the permanent members. Now, I have heard it often that, you know, there's only one country which is opposed to India's aspirations for permanent membership. But I would point out, based on the negotiations I have participated in, that none of the other 4 have also done anything inside these negotiations to move the process forward. In fact, the permanent members are very happy to be invisible almost in the negotiations. And that, in a sense, also reflects on how their leadership role of 1945 has changed so much in the year 2020. Some of them, I will not take names, but I think some of the permanent members cannot be considered leaders in the political area today as they were in 1945. And I think that therefore, to reflect this reality, we need to work on it from within. And I think that's the main point that I'd like to make, that the reforms have to be done from within the system. I don't think sometimes it is said that you should break the system to reform it. But the world in 2020 will not allow us to break the system for one simple reason, and that is that it will be impossible to negotiate a treaty like we did in San Francisco in 1945, which was accepted by all the participants who sat in that negotiating hall. Today, you cannot expect 193 countries to negotiate and adopt a treaty to replace the UN Charter. And therefore, we have to reform it from within the Charter. And there are ways to do it, which I can talk about later.
Mr. Solheim, these vested interests that you're talking about, we're discussing the P5 as well, silent partners in negotiations, Ambassador Mukherjee is pointing out. What will kickstart, or what is the catalyst that will force them to recognize the changing world that you and Ambassador Mukherjee have described so aptly? We did think at one point of time it could have been COVID, but they haven't been able to deal with COVID itself.
I think we always have to realize that change is difficult and change is slow, and that's because there are vested interests to keep everything like it is. So you need a stronger movement from below. I mean, people telling that leaders of the world that we cannot go on like this any longer. the key institution of the UN must reflect the world of 2020, not the world of 1945. I mean, it's not even doing that, but at least it must reflect the world of 2020. And in this world, there are, in my view, 4 key power centers. I mean, China, obviously, the United States, obviously, Europe combined, obviously, and India. Russia, we may add. These are the obvious centers which will have to be reflected in if you want to make a distinction between the core main powers of the world and other nations. And then you need some arrangement to encompass the interests of Africa or Latin America and others who will not be easily reflected in this constellation. You need that, and then you need brave initiatives from the top leaders.
Brave initiatives. I am going to take again Tanuj Abe Khanna, who says, do we need to have another war and somebody surrender to bring about this change, because it ain't happening otherwise? Ambassador Mukherjee, on a more serious note, since you've been involved in this now, the intergovernmental negotiations that have been going on since 2005, we don't see any movement on that. But you have another option which you think and have been propagating in terms of going back to the UN Charter and advocating a general council, a general conference, I beg your pardon?
Well, Amitav, this is a point which actually goes back to 2005. In 2005, when all the world leaders agreed to reform the Security Council, then in that same summit, when the proposal for convening a general conference of the United Nations under the Charter was put forward, it was said at that time that when the Security Council reform takes place, the General Conference will have to meet, because all the members have to come together. But now that in 2020, we see clearly that there is no prospect of ending this intergovernmental negotiation, which has no time frame. I think the demand for convening a general conference of the United Nations to look at all aspects of the United Nations. It's not only Security Council reform, but to look at all the other provisions of the Charter to bring the provisions up to date with the 21st century, and to provide for a new energy and impulse. I think that cannot be avoided anymore. And it is my hope that the 75th session, which has started of the General Assembly, will actually agree to hold a general conference, which is provided for in Article 109 of the UN Charter. It's a treaty provision. It has not been opposed. It can't be vetoed. The conference can be held. Now, what happens with the outcome of the conference, of course, is much more political. But unless we have the conference, we can't move ahead. And I think the last point I'd like to make, and take on what Mr. Solheim referred to, is that in the year 2020, we cannot limit this only to the governments. There are stakeholders in the multilateral system. And we have seen it in the field of digital cooperation with the Tunis agenda. We have stakeholders, cyber. We have seen it in the sustainable development negotiations. We had clearly identified 4 stakeholders, and all the stakeholders participated. So the UN, when it convenes its general conference, will have to provide for participation by stakeholders, which goes beyond governments. Otherwise, the UN will not be effective and not be able to respond to global challenges.
Mr. Solheim, if you want to respond to 2 stakeholders, I mean, whether it's business or whether it's NGOs, other society members, and their obligations as well, I presume, would be needed, right, Ambassador Mukherjee? But Mr. Solheim?
I think he's hitting the ball exactly right. This is the other big culture shift which is needed in the UN. You need an organization that understands the world outside. It's not focused inside on itself and its own bureaucratic structures. I've been to any number of meetings where I ask, what is the output? How does this influence the world? And people say, oh, it's so successful because last year we arranged 2 seminars and we made 3 reports. but that's not results. Results is to reduce global poverty, to improve the environment footprint, and to make sure that we're not destroying Mother Earth. That's the result, and to measure that. And then you need to look to what I will call the political economy. If Prime Minister Modi wants to develop India, which he wants, it's not about conferences, it's about mobilizing business, the reliance of Tata, Mahindras of India, all the other companies to get foreign investment. And it's of course about mobilizing the people for this great effort to bring all Indians out of poverty and do it in a green way. But the UN need to be a supporter of business and governments and understand that. I give you one example. I once spoke to one of the UN resident coordinators in New Delhi, and he told me, look, Eric, the UN is using $400 million a year in India. And then he added, and we are doing nothing which is of interest to Prime Minister Modi. Why is that? Well, they're doing a small program for women in Assam, another small environment program in Tamil Nadu, maybe a school in Madhya Pradesh. But there are 700,000 villages in India. This doesn't come together to any major impact. If you want impact, you must understand business and you must understand political decisions. And unfortunately, here there is a need for a huge culture shift in the UN.
Mr. Mukherjee, if you want to elaborate on that thought a little more in terms of simplifying it for our audience and why that is so important.
Well, I think that, the participation of stakeholders, and by stakeholders, it's, of course, governments, because governments have to negotiate the treaty, but it's business, as Mr. Solheim has pointed out. And I must say, during the Sustainable Development Goal negotiations, there was no participation by Indian business at all, which is quite surprising. And then, of course, there's civil society and youth. We should not forget that a large part of this whole focus of the UN Charter, which begins with the words, we the peoples, is represented by civil society and youth. And we need to galvanize it. I'm very optimistic of this because in India, when you participate in the model United Nations meetings organized by high school children, there are thousands and thousands of them. So there's obviously a large amount of potential energy in the country in favor of multilateralism. But unfortunately, there is a gap between that potential energy and how it is actually used. And as Mr. Solheim says, we end up looking at conferences and some project reports, and that is not the objective for which the United Nations was conceived. It is to eradicate poverty, it is to make a change and difference in people's lives. And I think that this is something that we need to look at. And as now the focus on reformed multilateralism is being talked about, our Prime Minister talked about it at the 75th anniversary summit on Monday. I think that reformed multilateralism, as he said, will have to have a human focus. It has to be human-centric. And that is where leadership will now be called upon internationally. We cannot exist only in the era of armament, disarmament, and war and obligations of states in war, etc., which are important. But we also have to bring the focus back to the human dimension. And I think the area where the United Nations will actually face this test is in how it responds to the emerging digital or cyber domain. Because the technology is such that it can easily take you away from the human dimension. And there are discussions going on this. But if the UN can get its act together and provide a digital home for the more than 7 billion people of the world, with all the issues that are linked with human participation, then I think the UN will be seen to be relevant to what we are doing.
So I'm just going back to some of your thoughts that you had made earlier. Let me take a comment and a question from Harshal Gore, who says, shouldn't the United Nations Security Council do away with veto power and go with consensus? Because just one country voting against a particular reform gets to shelf that particular reform. Example, China just has stonewalls all. And another link to one thought that you had mentioned, Mr. Solheim, is from Lady Anon. She says, is Mr. Solheim suggesting that the EU become a permanent member of the UNSC? So are you saying that Britain and France give up their permanent seats, and is that even possible, Mr. Solheim?
The obvious answer to European participation in the Security Council is that the European Union is represented there. That's the overriding institution which has the confidence of the vast majority of Europeans, and it will give Europe the weight which is normal for Europe, 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 6 or 7 permanent seats. So I think that's the obvious answer to that. On the veto power, as much as I would personally want to see it reduced, still I think it's a difficult proposition. And I mean, if you look to India, you cannot really compare India to, say, the Maldives and say India 1 vote, the Maldives 1 vote. it's hard to think that the president of the United States of America, whoever it is, would accept that every nation, big or small, should have the same weight. So you must have a system which is reflecting both the fact that we are 200 nations, but also the fact that some of these nations at the end are more powerful and also much more populated than the others. I mean, you can add, I don't know the exact number, but maybe 100 nations combined will still be the population of India.
Ambassador Mukherjee, talking about India now and just looking forward again to January 2021 and then 2022 when we take up the leadership of G20, what can India achieve within the Security Council, even as a non-permanent and non-veto-wielding member, to further reform that the Prime Minister has also made a focus of his initial speech?
Well, I think that sitting inside the council chamber gives any country an advantage. And I think that the trend that we have seen in the last few years, which has been actually led by the European states in the Security Council, of coordinating more among the elected, what we call non-permanent, but they're all elected members. I think that will make one difference. And I think that the way the elected members have coordinated themselves in the council in the past 2 or 3 years is something that should be carried forward, because that has a certain momentum and a weight. The second thing that I think for India will be important is to actually focus on issues which are directly linked with India's specific national interests. And by these, I mean issues which are on the agenda of the Security Council, but on which nothing seems to be done or happening. And these are issues like Afghanistan, Yemen, the situation in the Gulf, including Iran, Syria, of course, and the eastern coast of Africa, which is the Western Indian Ocean, where there are some conflicts which have been going on endlessly. And so India has an opportunity to actually galvanize this group of elected members and be in partnership with those interested permanent members to find solutions which are sustainable on the ground, starting, for example, with Yemen, which is today the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, and from where some very illustrious Indian corporate families have originated. I mean, it's not that this is some far-off place. It is which was part of the Bombay presidency, Aden. So I think that this is something that we need to look at. And by this process, what will also happen is that the current imbalance in the way the Security Council deals with issues in Asia will get corrected. Because right now, the Asian issues are either dealt with by the former colonial permanent members, or they are put as a negotiation ball between the 5 permanent members to do what they want. And there is therefore no effective participation by Asian countries who are elected to the Security Council in decisions of the Security Council concerning our own continent. And I think it's a small beginning, but it's something that I think should be done. And the last point is linked with what you mentioned about the G20. And I think this goes back to what Mr. Solheim talked about, which is that today the economic weight and the economic sort of contribution that member state can make does make a huge difference on the ground. And for example, in the case of Afghanistan, India's development assistance has to be factored into whatever political outcome the Security Council takes on Afghanistan. And that means also upholding where we have invested in women's rights, in employment of women, in children, in health, in education. Now, these issues cannot be pushed off the table just because you want to engage with people who are earlier in the sanctions list of the Taliban. So we need to actually assert this. Thank you.
Mr. Solheim, you want to take that thought of how can India play a role in the United Nations Security Council in terms of galvanizing? Because I would presume that you would think one of the key areas or achievements of the United Nations has been in peacekeeping.
I think Ambassador Mukherjee is exactly right. Of course, he was a very distinguished ambassador, and I have been friends with quite a few UN ambassadors of India. And I think India should step up, be even braver, and demand, let's call it a place in the sun. Remember that the UN was formed at a time when basically all of Asia was dirt poor. There were 90% of Asians at the time were extremely poor. China was poor, India was poor, there was poverty all over the place. And it was a step starting at a time when the United States was the far dominant power of the world. This has changed enormously. The economic growth in China and India and in many other Asian nations, and there is hardly any low-income country left in Asia. And the population of Asia is of course very big. The UN has 6 regional groups, and they're treated basically on the same level. But reality is that 60% of humanity is living in one group, the Asian group, and it's treated as if it's just one group. And power, economy, everything has moved so much from the Western Hemisphere to Asia these days, and still the UN and so many global institutions are still in the old frame. True, many of them served us well for some time. True, the United States of America did well to the world in establishing the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, all these institutions, but they were given an American stamp, and now time has come for a major shift because the world is changing. And unfortunately, the global institutions are changing much, much slower than the world. That's also, by the way, one of the reasons why China has established quite a good number of, I would say, parallel structures. For instance, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank as a parallel structure to the World Bank, because they didn't feel that the present system was reflective enough of Chinese interest, and I don't think it's reflecting enough of Indian interest either.
Well, talking about Chinese interests, Ambassador Mukherjee, within the UN system itself, you've seen how we've had to deal. Terrorism, it doesn't have an international definition as yet, which is incredible. But China, the Masood Azhar issue, Pakistan, and how that was stonewalled for so long at the United Nations Security Council, that was overcome. How do you see that? And the thought that that Ms. Solheim brought out in terms of China, I want to just turn it around a little bit in terms of how China is moving up the ladder in various UN organizations to further its interest.
Well, I'm glad you asked this question, because none of the permanent members are in the United Nations for altruistic motives. They are there for their own national interest.
Sure.
And I don't think even United States, which is withdrawing from all the other institutions, will withdraw from the Security Council. So therefore, I think that we need to actually come face to face with this reality and look at it on how it works. And you have pointed to one example of countering terrorism. And I think that in countering terrorism, the failure of the Security Council to prevent any terrorist acts from taking place despite having such an elaborate structure is basically because they tend to continue to deal with countering terrorism as a political issue, rather than as an issue which needs to galvanize international cooperation. And therefore, to expect countries to not fulfill their obligations under the UN Security Council resolution or the UN Charter opens up other possibilities which we are now seeing. For example, in the Indian agenda for priorities in the Security Council, one area is to expand cooperation with non-UN bodies like the Financial Action Task Force to counter terrorism. Now, that is something that is a new way of doing things, but it's also an indictment of the current system. And I think that reform, therefore, has to take place on how do you use vetoes. Now, the French have a very interesting proposal of limiting the use of the veto for any mass atrocity crimes. And I think that if we were to engage in a discussion in the overall reform of the United Nations on how the French initiative should actually apply to, say, 99% of issues on the UN Security Council's agenda, and then see whether this veto is actually necessary or not. Because today the veto is being used by China for purposes not linked with problems faced by India, but for its own geopolitical interests in Asia or in a larger context. So therefore, that is important. And the other point, and the last point I'd like to make, is that we need to actually stress the unity of mankind as the soul of international cooperation. This is something that Dr. Radhakrishnan spoke of before the United Nations was formed and in UNESCO. And I think that unless we focus on the unity of mankind, we will not be able to achieve what we set out to do in reforming the United Nations.
Mrs. Solheim, we've been looking back at 75 years of the United Nations. How would you look forward to the next 25?
First of all, we should remind ourselves that these 75 years has been a period of unprecedented human progress. There has never in human history been anything like this. Life expectancy has moved from about 40 until now being on average for the world 72. There are a few children who are not starting in school, but there are very few. There have been enormous poverty alleviation. Just in the last 2 decades, we have halved global poverty. So that has been absolutely unprecedented progress. Just as a personal note, I mean, first time I visited India, that was in the 1980s. At the time, there were hundreds of thousands of polio cases in India. Last 7 years, how many? Not one. I mean, what kind of progress isn't that? So let's celebrate that progress. UN may have been not the main institution for this, but it has helped some of these processes, even if political decisions and business and the engagement of millions upon millions of people in their own destiny all over the world has been the driving factor. But it has been a successful period. I'm optimistic that this will continue. The one issue I'm working the most with, environment and climate, there is not such a change. Just a couple of years back, it went very slow. Now it goes very fast. In India, the price of solar is much lower than coal. So why would you go into coal when you save money going into solar? And the United States, all the big tech companies, the Microsoft and Googles of this world, are now embarked upon amazing strategies for the environment, which are much better than any nation. I mean, much better than Trump, obviously, but much better than any nation anywhere in the world has done. So we see very, very positive signals, and I'm optimistic that we will continue the progress, even if COVID-19 obviously is a step backward.
Ambassador Mukherjee, as someone who's worked against the obduracy of the system in changing, how would you like to take the last words in terms of what you see over the next 25 years?
Well, I think that if we were to bring in the drivers of change, as I call it, and by that I mean multi-stakeholderism, youth, these voices into efforts to reform the United Nations from within, we will be able to reach the objective. But if we leave it only to the current structures of governments, many of whom are frozen in time, then I do not think that the UN can be reformed very quickly. So we need to look at the structure, the provisions, but we most of all need to bring in this new energy, which is there outside. I mean, all of us who have worked now outside the UN, we have seen that it's there in the field, it's there in the villages, in the cities of all member states of the United Nations, because no one wants to be left behind, and everyone wants to collaborate and be part of a bigger world. So I think that this is something that we need to tap into, and I hope that countries like India will be the leaders of this process of bringing this new energy into the United Nations.
Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, thank you for joining this discussion and lending all your experience and insights.
Thank you.
And Erik Solheim, all the way from Oslo, it was a pleasure again to have you on the show. Thank you so much again, Mr. Solheim.
Thank you.
And you can go onto our website, log on to get the latest news and analysis from an Indian point of view. Do send us your feedback, your comments, questions, anything that you want us to target in our next discussions. And also do help us with our initiative and our kind of journalism by supporting it on our website. You've been watching Stat News Global. I'm Amit Agre.